Thank you so much, Catherine. That is such a wonderful recap of all that occurred yesterday and all of the wonderful recommendations and thoughts and discussions that happened. We will now be having a panel discussion on the 4C's, COVID, climate, conflicts, and children. We would invite those that are going to be involved in that to come on stage. Dr. Catherine Marshall, Vice President of G20 Interfaith Forum, will be the moderator. And our panelists will include Sadhvi Bhagawati Saraswati, Secretary General of Global Interfaith WASH Alliance, Rabbi Diana Gerson, Associate Executive, VP, New York Board of Rabbis, Safak Pavi, Senior Advisor, UNHCR, and Reverend Fletcher Harper, Executive Director of Green Faith. This discussion is kind of a continuation of what happened in the UAE when we first started talking about these 4C's, which we mentioned in the UAE meeting as being kind of a focus for this year. So we're really happy to have these panelists to be able to discuss these 4C's. Again, they are conflict, children, climate, and COVID, especially in the context of one Earth, one family, one future, and as partners in action towards taking care of these 4C's. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you again. I'm sorry you get to hear my scratchy voice a bit more. The theme of the 3C's is one that has been discussed fairly broadly in reflecting on the polycrisis, the multiple sets of crises that we face, and what we call the permacrisis, in other words, that it never seems to end. And the very brief summary of what are the critical elements of the crises is, first of all, recovering from what Harsh Shringla described as the largest disruption since the end of World War II, which has been the COVID crisis, which is, I think, an era of our history that we have all lived vividly. We would like to forget that it ever happened, but we are still in a process of emerging, I think, from the COVID crisis. Secondly, and really a disturbing finding from many of those who are watching situations in the world, is that the conflict situation in the world, which we had been fairly hopeful was improving, is deteriorating. And it is both the overt conflicts, but also tensions and polarizations within societies. So this notion of conflict is a particularly critical issue. And third, we have the, I think, increasing awareness of the enormous and urgent threats to the global climate. So those are the three sort of classic polycrisis themes that many leaders are looking at. But what we are suggesting and urging is that a fourth be added, which is the focus on children. And that having that as a central theme gives a sense of meaning and purpose to the G20 interfaith. So that is the theme of this morning's first panel. And what we are hoping to do is to look at some of the lessons that we see coming out of the reality that we are all living, and also how we need to change course. And we have the global architecture of the Sustainable Development Goals agreed to in 2015. But there's, first of all, a very clear recognition by the more sober souls among us that the targets of the SDGs will not be achieved by 2030, that we're well behind on many of them, but also that changing circumstances call us to look in different ways and to look at innovation and imagination, the prophetic voice, which we would like to think is a part of the gift, but also the challenge of the G20 Interfaith Forum. So with that, we do have our panelists today cross all of these sectors in many ways, but to some extent they are cast in one of the 4C's. So what I will ask is for each one of our panelists to introduce themselves and how they situate themselves in these challenges. And maybe they can at least lay out in this first round a few challenges that they see for the ways in which they would like to see the G20, but also the G20 Interfaith, reframe in light of the experience, but also in light of the current challenges that we face. So why don't we just go along and start with Sadhvi and go along the line.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. The COVID crisis was in many ways the perfect antidote for anyone who thought that we are not interconnected, interlinked, and interdependent. It was the perfect antidote for anyone who thought that the actions of one or a few in one part of the world did not have ripple impacts all over the world. And it showed us beyond any doubt that in order for any of us to be healthy or to be safe, we actually need everyone to be healthy and safe. The idea that somehow I can live a healthy, safe life when my community is neither healthy nor safe, that idea was wiped out, because unless you wanted to stay in the four walls of your literal house forever, eating only care of delivery and Amazon, we literally need our communities to be healthy and safe in order for us to stay healthy and safe walking out into the communities. It also was a very harsh and very tragic wake-up call for anyone who was living in the delusion of equality, equity with regard to resources, with regard to opportunities. In India, we had what I think of as two waves. I know there were lots of surges with regard to actual viral rate, but there were really two waves that showed us death and despair and despondency. The first wave, because of the immediate lockdown, we ended up without nearly as many deaths, but we ended up in a situation where in a country full of migrant workers who left villages. I come from the state of Uttarakhand, which is not far from here, but we are the Himalayan state, and where almost every single house in the state has at least one, if not more, people who are serving in Delhi, Mumbai, Calcutta as low-wage earners. They're cooks, they're sweepers, they're drivers, they're dishwashers. And the minute that the lockdown happened, everybody wanted to come back. And so we ended up with literally hundreds of thousands of people at the border of the state, saying things quite literally like, "It is my right to die at home. okay, we're gonna die, because what everybody was saying was, you can't move, because if you come in, you're carrying illness from these big cities into the villages. We don't have the health care. And what we were left with was what really felt like a human rights crisis of, do people have the right to die at home, even if it means infecting villages? So it was a lose-lose situation for quite some time. And of course, as you know, the next wave that hit in 2021 was a wave of death. We began to speak yesterday, Dr. Vinu Aram mentioned the impact on vaccinations of children when they stopped going to school, how they stopped getting vaccinations. In addition to that, they stopped getting free meals. So in a lot of cases, kids stopped getting food. In a lot of cases, kids stopped getting drinking water. From the technology standpoint, we touched upon that a little bit yesterday as well. I remember at our ashram trying to reach anyone in the ashram before the hours of noon was impossible. Why? Because their mobile phone was in their kids' hands, because their kids were doing their schoolwork on the mobile phones of the parents. The kids don't have mobiles. Parents had given the mobiles to the kids. You could not reach anyone because the parents had given the kids mobiles. We, of course, opened up computer centers for them all to use. But taking that further, if you look on a financial level, the World Bank recent report mentioned that it's very likely that there could be about a 10% lower income when these students are income-earning members of society simply due to the impact, the trauma of the COVID time, and that as far as cognitive development, children who were toddlers during the pandemic have about a 25% chance, or there's about 25% lower income when they become wage earners. So this pandemic is far from over in terms of the ripple impacts. And I think that that's really critical for us to address, is we're not just looking at how to prevent the next one, we're still looking at the ripple ramifications of this one. Climate, we saw in India, the emissions were down more than 50%. The PM10s, PM2.5s emissions were down more than 50% of both of them. We actually had CCTV cameras capturing elephants coming down and walking through the streets and bathing in Ganga. And so it removed any doubt that might have been in anyone's mind that we were the problem. That's a critical point for us, I think, to also remember, is it's our very specific actions, it's our lifestyles, it's the way we are living that are creating the climate crises that we're facing. And then lastly, as we move into conflict, well, we saw it. We saw the domestic violence rates, child abuse rates skyrocket. We saw the rates of violence between people of different religions skyrocket, with scapegoating, with vilification. But along with all of that, what we saw was people of faith, faith leaders, faith-based organizations stepping up to provide all of it. So it gave us a whole new definition of security. We had all of the guns and missiles, but we realized what we needed were gloves and masks that we didn't have. And faith leaders, faith-based organizations were coming right up. I mean, I know we were from day one feeding as many as we could, hundreds and hundreds and then thousands, first hot meals, and then when the lockdown got stricter, bags of rations for people's home, providing medical care. We turned our entire yoga village into a 100-bed COVID care center and a vaccination center, and did all of the public service announcements that went out via WhatsApp, both around COVID-appropriate behavior, but also around ending the vilification and othering amongst religions. And lastly, there's so much to share, but I want to stop. Lastly, I just wanted to offer, as we begin this session, on these 4C's, can we move together into 4 new C's, which is connection, the awareness, the constant memory reminders that we are responsible for each other, that is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. We are responsible for each other. That means everyone. So, connection, courage and creativity to really look at new solutions, new priorities, healthcare, a new vision, a new definition of security. What does that even mean? To have the courage to look again at the dismal lack of equality and equity amongst people with regard to resources. And lastly, of course, cohesion. That awareness once again that we are in this boat together and that it's really going to take all of us to address all of these crises. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Sadhvi, and you've given us, I think, a vivid picture of the world's most populous country as it experienced the COVID, and 4 new C's to inspire us as we go along. So let's turn to Diana. I think that the children is probably your main focus, but I suspect you also see the intersections and the connections in ways that are unmistakable.
So good morning, everybody, and it's wonderful to say good morning and not good afternoon, good evening, and everything else, because we're not all in different parts of the world, but we're all together. And I think there is so much gratitude for the opportunity to be together. And certainly coming through COVID, I live in New York City, and at one point, New York City was the epicenter of the epicenter, and I remember sitting in my apartment and listening to the sirens go by and the refrigerator trucks at the end of the street. And we realized very quickly how we are interconnected. My survival and your survival are connected. My well-being and your well-being are connected. My success and my longevity and our planet's longevity is connected. You and me, we may never have met, we're connected. The Talmud, which is a compendium of religious beliefs and writings from the rabbis, the sages of the Jewish people. People say we're the people of the book. I say we're the people of many books. We have a lot of books. But the Talmud teaches, do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. The rabbis often debated, if I could only have time today, or I only have the capacity today, or only the energy today to fulfill half of my obligation, should I even begin? And one rabbi, Rabbi Shammai, says, if you can't say the whole blessing, don't even bother getting started. Anybody ever feel that way? And on the other side, Rabbi Hillel said, no. A half a mitzvah, half an obligation, might lead us to the whole one. In fact, how does that play out in even my own life? If you walk into a lot of Jewish homes, you're going to see that like the whole wall is painted, except for this teeny little square. You leave that for the next person. because we are always completing each other's work. We're always building upon the generation before us, the family before us, the people whose shoulders we stand upon. But Savi, you spoke so much about connection, and it just resonated because it's so much about what I was thinking about and mulling over. In 2019, David Brooks, who's an opinion writer for the New York Times, he posits the question in the paper, what binds our societies together? And he basically boiled it down to 4 things, not much like the 4 things we're talking about today. But he says we are bound by our love for our children. We are bound to our society for our work for the good. We're bound together by our love for our place. And we are bound by our shared humanity. It is about the humility of the head and the ardor of the heart when we seek to build a beloved and, dare I say, a sacred community for all. When you look at the SDGs, you go, okay, so I'm going to focus on SDG 4. No, if I'm going to do SDG 4, I have to do 6. And if I do 6, I have to do 16. And that doesn't work until I do 3. Ever notice that? Because they're all connected. They're hooked to each other. One doesn't work without the others. Nothing is freestanding. There's nothing that we do that is freestanding. And in a world as complicated as ours is, 84% of people seem to identify with the faith community, which is rather extraordinary. And even when they say they're one of the nuns, as we heard yesterday, thank you, Cole, for bringing up the nuns, and we're not talking about Catholic nuns, we're talking about people who identify with no faith community. And many of them will also say that they are, in fact, deeply spiritual, which means that they are looking for connectivity again, but they are not necessarily so sure about organized traditional faith structures. And I have to say, I understand for some their skepticism. What happens when we see obligation and we do not experience, in fact, the reality that our faith institutions always act in the most moral ways that actually help to lift up societies and lift up its members. And when people face challenges and difficulties and are in crisis, we do know that they turn to faith leaders. We know that when there is issues of domestic violence, elder abuse, child abuse, sexual assault, who do people go to for help? Statistically, we know that they're going to go to their family members first. They're going to go to their friends, maybe. Their faith leader is a definite resource. And they'll come to you, and they're not going to necessarily say, this is what happened. They're going to test you first to see if you're open, to see if you're willing to even have the conversation with them. And if you are, they will share with you their heart and their soul. And that is a treasure, because then we have an opportunity. And we know that as faith leaders and faith communities, we are often the first responders. We saw that during the COVID crisis when we needed supplies. It was the faith communities that stood up and said, how do we help? We delivered meals, and I'm talking all the faith communities. We all figured out how to do this together. I know in New York City, we are a city of houses of worship. We all showed up. And when we said, we need spiritual, sacred texts for our first responders, for the doctors, the nurses, the ambulance workers, what did we do? We flooded the state with prayer books and Bibles and sacred texts, and we made a difference to make sure that even in the darkest hours that they had the spiritual uplift. And we know that we have to use our traditions and our sacred role as that resource for our communities. And we have to make sure we're not a roadblock and we don't cause any harm. I often think about what we need to do in society, and I think about the needs of our children. Now, our children, when I was a kid, children should be seen and not heard. I had a rabbi who would say, if a child was crying in synagogue, he will be like, will somebody please remove this crying child? The child is disrupting the prayer. And today, I don't think that happens so much because we welcome the families in and we want them to be present and we want the children to run around and feel connected, that this is their space. And in the same way, we need to make sure that the world that we are creating is that safe space. It's their space. For children live in the world of today that honestly doesn't belong to us anymore. We are yesterday's news as adults. The children, this is their moment. And we have to be those role models. We have to help them. We have to be trained. We have to be educated. We have to help lift them up. Which means that when we're making policies, and this is where this work here comes so into focus, if we're going to talk about COVID, and we're going to talk about climate, and we're going to talk about vulnerable populations, we have to make sure that when we're making policies that they're good for children, all children. And if the policy is good for every child, and we leave no child behind, then that policy has the capacity to change things. I know without any doubt that we all in this room have a voice. You have a voice, I have a voice. And when we unify those voices, we have not just a prophetic voice, but we have an enormous amount of soft power. And how do we take that power and use it for the greater good? Martin Luther King, who I know was quoted yesterday so beautifully, he reminds us, even today, that there is no deficit in human resources. The deficit is in human will. We have to do better. And as most children will tell you, do more.
Thank you. Now we have, I think, a very spiritual call as well as a vision from New York. Safak, you deal with some of the most difficult issues in the world today that I think come under the heading of conflict but overlap with everything else. How do you see the moment that we face today?
Sure, of course, Catherine, and I don't think any of the C's are disconnected from each other. They're very much intertwined as well, just like Sandy was saying, how interconnected we are, that COVID has proven. But maybe I would like to start then with COVID and then what it has shown us in a mirror of ourselves as an international society. Surely a pandemic connected and intertwined us and showed us that we can't survive detached from each other, and we need international solidarity more than any other time, not just for economy, to survive, to stay alive as members of the world society. Coming to the G20 as well. Some of the countries represented in the G20 committed group were very forthcoming when it came to international solidarity issues as international donors as well to the refugee cause, to their prominent donors. So the refugee cause including, that is our mandate. But what we have seen is that some of them have acted completely contradictory to the principles that they were promoting for and in the international arena for the others to follow. That is, again, some of the countries there has actually taken and bought 10 times more of their population, the amount of vaccines that they have given, outside of their overseas to the least developed countries that didn't have access to vaccines, amounted to almost nothing compared to what they have gotten in their stocks for years and decades to cover their population. So that showed us that international solidarity is not only should be pronounced by words, but we need to walk the talk as well. And some of the countries like India, for instance, with lesser resources available, but still chose the path of regionally as well as overseas humanitarian aid support when it came to vaccine sharing. So we saw different behaviors contradictory to the talks sometimes, and that showed us that we haven't reached to a level after the UN system was created. We can date it back, if you wish, to League of Nations or post-World War II that has actually created the Charter of the UN that speaks to the very core human rights principles, standards, and also international communities support each other and solidarity as well as peace building. So 75 plus years hasn't actually, when we came to the contemporary times of where we witnessed COVID-19, we haven't seen that principles necessarily coming at play by some of the leaders. That was something mirroring us, and different countries with very little at their disposition when it came to resources also showed more solidarity when we were speaking of like refugees as the most vulnerable layer of society. So sometimes completely invisible because they are not included in the national system. So, so that shows us. Yesterday we had a wonderful professor, Indian professor, who gave us some anthropological and sociological clues. He was master of statistics, but that showed us the discrimination levels works in mysterious ways towards different layers of society. And refugees are one of the most stigmatized, and that not in the Indian context I'm talking about, in most of the societies. When it came to distribution of vaccines as well, we could see societal stigmatization that if refugees had access before anybody else, there was a big resistance to it. So we actually had to make sure that there is no social explosion happening at different parts of the world with the distribution of vaccinations to the society, to the host community first, and then refugees when their turn was given. So when it comes to, so for me, in the humanitarian aid system, that showed a big discrepancy, and that gives even further responsibility to the shoulders of G20 community of states to at least act as in one when it comes to humanitarian crises such as COVID-19 or at times of conflict. Again, today we are facing unprecedented numbers. 103 million forcibly displaced people currently, with also additional erupted conflicts since COVID-19, such as Ukraine, Afghanistan regime change, and Ethiopia context, Sudan. As of today, we are speaking of more displacement coming out. And Venezuela displacement still continued. So layers and layers of forced displacement added, with also climate change coming to play. Like, just to speak of some numbers, surely every refugee represents, when we speak of this large number of 103 million people forcibly displaced today, that is unprecedented and at an increasing trend as well. Imagine at every person displaced represents actually every failure for a peace process or for a prevention process. So each person displaced is actually a failed peace building, whether it is at the very local level of a societal tension that was not diffused timely, or warmongering that was not stopped by timely, again, prevention and call for peace-building efforts to replace it instead. So, it is a big failure then, if each person represents a failure of peace building. So then we need actually the international community to come to its senses and contribute further, not only for humanitarian aid efforts, but to developments together with those that are in need. Here, I just would like to make another statistics known that 80% of refugees and forcibly displaced are actually being hosted in the least or lower and middle income, least developed or lower and middle income at the most countries. So it is actually not in the developed world as per se. So say in a Syrian context, it is Jordan, it is Lebanon, it is Turkey as the core host countries that are currently hosting the highest number of refugees in the world. And they are climate fragile countries as well. So, and most of the refugees are actually coming from, 70% of refugees are coming from highly climate fragile countries, climate vulnerable countries. When floods hit Pakistan, it is actually equally hitting refugees and host community members together as, again, a very large refugee hosting country. So when it hits, when any kind of climate sensitive issue happens in Kenya, refugees and the host community are hit in the same way, but not equally in terms of survival possibilities and opportunities, unless they are included in the national systems, they have an identity, they can actually resort to life-saving opportunities that could be available to the local community. So, so there is a political commitment that is needed, definitely from G20 group, for more efforts to be invested equally, not at the emergency, at the face of emergencies, for humanitarian aid distribution, but also equally for development, equally for inclusive development, let me put it that way, as well as peace-building efforts. If we forget the third leg, none of these will matter, because then layer by layer, the crisis, as Catherine puts it very rightly so, polycrisis, as we're standing today in today's world, we will not be able to solve anything. So, and the linkage between climate change as a driver for conflict as well should be recognized. That because when the resources diminish at the very local level, you would know it from your precious work at different parts of the world. Tensions between, not only between different tribes, let's say, if it is a tribal context, even between gender starts there. It is a conflict driver in a household as well. When the resources are scarce, and that is definitely causing a very basic psychological level, let's leave sociology aside, a household to a violence, be it that is gender-based violence, be it towards the children, that was also mentioned by wonderful Diana, Rabbi. So, so it is, so climate change for us is not only a driver for forced displacement, but driver for conflict as well. We could see that linkage very clearly in the displacement movements. And we would like that recognition to be made, including, because once that is made by such a powerful group of states coming together, that is very important to recognize it, because then what COP27 recognized, for instance, for loss and damage funds to be available, will equally be distributed with that recognition and acknowledgement of the linkage to the displaced populations that may be recognized from borderline passing as a refugee, or within the countries themselves as internal displaced persons. So, so we are in the same space with anyone that is being impacted by climate change and its effects. One more thing that maybe with this 4C's, I really don't think that we can detach a W from there, because children, I believe in every refugee context where we have also control of programming, let's say in refugee camp situations, we know it for sure that any kind of mitigation efforts, any kind of prevention effort starts with the women head of household, and children to be included into the programs and policies of any kind of survival methods at the face of emergencies, natural disasters, and conflicts, starts with investing in the women head of household, seeing them as included in the programming of any policy across the globe. So I believe that we need that W in that 4C's very much at the very center of it. So centralizing women would be perhaps an addition as a fifth leg to that 4C's as a solution. Because we see that that is the only way that sustainable development, even with the vantage point of seeing different refugee camp situations and how we turn them into a self-reliable, self-sufficient spaces, is through investing into women leading programs, as well as the self-generating livelihood methods. So that we see very much linked with the children's well-being as well. So this is where I want to stop, maybe, and I'm ready to also respond to any kind of questions or comments that may come.
Well, as you see, each of our panelists has a lot to say, and we're not finished. I do want to highlight one comment that Suffolk made. The international community has to come to its senses. I think that's very much the sort of G20 message. So Fletcher, you come with a particular focus, but I think you will also navigate us through the different dimensions of the crisis and the ways that they're interconnected. But above all, because believe it or not, the time is running on and we do want to look ahead, perhaps you can guide us into thinking the lessons learned, but where do we go in the future?
Sure, and thank you. It's good to be here. I'm going to start with a story about climate change and about all of the issues we've discussed this morning. So a woman, a Somalian farmer named Amina Muse, had lived on a small plot of land about 3 hours outside of Mogadishu, same land that her family had farmed for generations. They weren't wealthy, small farmers, small plot of land, like many, many billions of other people around the planet. A few animals, enough to get by, not wealthy, but subsistence and able to survive. About 7 years ago, painful, crippling droughts began to hit Somalia, as is increasingly the case around the globe, climate-induced for certain. And people started leaving the countryside and going into the city out of desperation, because when there is no rain and when your animals die, there is no way to survive. So Amina held on longer than most, and one day, out of a sense of utter desperation, she called a friend who had moved into a refugee settlement on the outskirts of Mogadishu several years earlier, and she said, "What's it like? I mean, this is just miserable here. We can't survive. What is it like where you are?" And her friend replied back, "It's awful. It's absolutely awful. We beg. It's not running water. The health conditions are terrible. Sexual violence all over the place. Unsafe for children. Absolutely miserable on every single front." And Amina hung up the phone, discouraged, considered her circumstances in the countryside, and she got up and she moved into the refugee settlement camp because she thought that it sounded as if there were better prospects for her physical survival than there were in the countryside. Got there, lived in a small, ramshackle, cardboard, corrugated metal hut, 2 by 3 meters, something like that, with her friend for a period of time. She was there, settled in as best as possible, began losing weight because there wasn't enough food to eat. And about a year and a half later, on the very last week of the calendar year, when the attention of the news media was distracted due to reduced staffing levels in newsrooms and year-end festivities, one morning at the barrier at the boundary of the refugee camp, a bank of 6 or 7 bulldozers appeared. And they were there because as more and more people had moved in from the countryside, the land was more valuable, and because of the lack of planning and lack of intervention by those with resources, developers wanted to get their hands on the land where 5,000 refugee households were settled. With 5 minutes of warning, the bulldozers blew their air horns and then proceeded to eradicate the refugee settlement. And at that point, the world lost touch with Amina. No one knows where she is, if she's alive, if she's dead. This story, magnified by tens of millions of times, is the story about climate change. It's a story about refugees. It's a story about the vulnerability of women and of children. And what is utterly unacceptable is that the G20 countries' response to this crisis, despite the fact that there are clear pathways forward, this is not an unsolvable crisis. It never has been. But the unwillingness of the world's most powerful economies and countries has been to continue to pour resources, $1 billion of subsidies a day, into new fossil fuel development. The major financial institutions of the world, $5.5 trillion, an increased level of financing for new fossil fuel projects since the Paris Climate Agreement was signed. And now, under the cover of the war in Ukraine, the drive towards energy security, which is a buzzword for accelerating further oil and gas development, the G7 meeting happening in Hiroshima in a couple of weeks. The energy and environment ministers a couple of weeks ago released their plan that called not only for an increase in gas production, but unthinkably, and in a level of accommodation to Japan, the host country, which is still heavily reliant on coal, the only developed economy to be continuing to make such an investment. The G7 energy ministers endorsed continued expansion of coal with the use of unproven technologies that supposedly will sequester carbon emissions. It's an utterly unworkable, unnecessary state of affairs. The pathway forward from a policy perspective is utterly clear. There's a need for a phase out of coal and all fossil fuels, equitably done so that those countries that need longer to make the transition have the opportunity to do so. There's a need for an immediate, rapid increasing scale up of renewable energy distribution. The good news with that is that study after study after study after study, and now the experience of regions that have done this, have shown that when you do this, you elevate standards of living, you create many more jobs than you create in the oil and gas sector with an equivalent investment of resources. You improve the well-being of women and children, you improve social well-being. All kinds of good things happen when communities get access to renewable energy. I would put a particular plug in for the need of funding for locally owned and women-owned renewable energy enterprises. 5 years ago, we started sort of saying these enterprises must be out there, and know-it-alls within the finance sector said, well, no, there are no women-owned and community-owned renewable energy enterprises of any meaningful scale. We did some research with colleagues at the Shine campaign. Within 18 months, had found over 100 scalable, proven women-led, community-owned enterprises with very, very modest needs for funding in order to scale. They have minimal access to funding at non-exploitive rates of return. The idea that there can't be $10 to $20 billion a year carved out of development budgets and out of, frankly, the regular capital markets in order to fund these enterprises and to get them to be able to scale so that they represent a viable alternative to the massive energy, global multinational energy conglomerates that want to continue to dominate the world's energy scene. The idea that these enterprises can't and shouldn't be scaled up is an utter failure of imagination. So the pathway forward is clear. You see cities around the world like Tokyo starting to consider requirements that all new construction has to include rooftop solar. You see countries around the world starting to say no more internal combustion engines after 2035. Why isn't the G20 endorsing these kinds of simple, common sense calls to action? The science has been clear, thanks to the fossil fuel industry, not since the 10s, not since the aughts or the 90s or the 80s, but since the 1970s. The knowledge has been there for 50 years. It has been purposefully hidden. It has been discredited on purpose. The merchants of doubt sort of approach that was so successful in delaying action on tobacco has been used successfully with fossil fuels. And I think that particularly in terms of a role of the religious sector, it's well recognized that the sort of power centers that prop up the fossil fuel-based energy system are a combination of extractive industries and either ineffective or corrupt governments. But what's not widely enough recognized is that in almost every place where you see a very strongly entrenched fossil fuel energy regime, you also see a substantially powerful, and I mean culturally and politically powerful, religious nationalism of the religious majority group in any given country, whether it's the evangelical bench in Brazil or the absolute nightmare of the white evangelical nationalism in the United States. You see it in different places, and I don't need to name names on that for those who are here present, but this factor of fundamentalist religious nationalism that is intolerant, that is anti-women, anti-LGBTQ, anti-environment, anti-indigenous, is a global pattern. And if forums like the G20 Interfaith Forum can't speak out about that and call that for what it is, then I really question, and all sort of moderate to progressive religious sectors. I hear the calls for accommodation, I hear the calls for inclusivity. For green faith, the question about inclusivity must stop when it comes to destroying people and planet. We have no space for religions that endorse that kind of program. And so I think that in the name of anything that's good, certainly in the name of future generations, whose concerns must be preeminent with this, who give us the gift of recognizing this crisis for the existential one that it is, much like people in my generation called for a nuclear sort of freeze, a nuclear treaty 30 to 40 years ago. The time is now. The answers are here. The question is not one of lack of knowledge. Certainly there will be further technological developments, but that's not the hurdle at this point. The question is, can religions play a powerful enough role in building a powerful social movement that, let's be frank, will create enough constructive disruption within the status quo that politicians will be forced to pay attention? That's the question that we face today.
We have about 15 minutes left in this session, and I'd like to open this to comments and questions. We have a set of challenges, I think, before us, and we have the weaving of the different elements of the challenges that we face. But do we have roving mics? Do we have a mic? And I see a hand over there. Maria Lucia, I think. It's traveling.
Thank you so much. This has been very insightful, and I want to build on what Reverend Fletcher just said. It's a call for action. What can we do? And I think I want to throw this question back to the panel. If we see a vacuum on ethical leadership in the world, and religious leaders are recognized for having this ethical leadership, what can we do to mobilize religious leaders for that? What is missing and what we can do? And I think this forum should help us find a way to get those religious leaders in a social movement to do exactly what you are saying, Reverend Fletcher. But what can we do? And is there something that out of this forum we can go and do immediately as a next step to mobilize those religious leaders? So I just want to throw back that question and very thought-provoking statements. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to leave that to the sort of final round of give each person the last word for the panel. But are there other hands? Yes.
Good morning. My name is Don Bosco, and I represent Talitakmi Unnati, which works to fight against human trafficking. And my question is to Rabbi Diana. Rabbi, you quoted Martin Luther King and said, there is no deficit of resources, but there is deficit of will. I really totally agree with that. And towards the end, you said, do more. And my question is, what recommendations do you give to India? Because we are dealing with forced begging. Children are forced, some children are forced into begging, and we have evidences of that right next to our hotel. Day before yesterday, we went and saw so many children there forced into begging. Second is forced dropouts. Because of COVID, so many young girls, young children are dropouts now. Forced dropouts and forced trafficked children. And the third is forced brides. Young girls are turned into brides. So these are the three forced trafficking activities that we come across. And by the way, this is the first time I'm meeting a female rabbi. And you set an example for all faith organizations to have female clerics. You spoke so passionately for children, and to me, you seem to be like a prophet for children or Mother Teresa for children. So what recommendations do you give for these three forced activities?
Firstly, thank you for the question, and I think we all can contribute to the answers. But I also want to focus on the reality that these are not circumstances that are unique only to India. They're universal. There are children who are seeking funds to survive, and they're surviving in any way that they can. I look around the room and I question, how many of us started working before the age of 18? Show of hands, how many of us started working before the age of 18? I'm one of them. That work is something that there is dignity in work. We need to make sure that we have work that is dignified, that we give children even young people opportunities to grow and to support their families that are dignified. If you travel around the world, you will see that I was reading somebody's dissertation recently, Dr. Susan Bissell, and she focused on manufacturing childhood. And the idea that children in Bangladesh are working, and to tell them that they're not having a childhood is absolutely untrue. Children will tell you themselves that this is their childhood, and supporting their families is something that they are very proud of. That a Western vision of childhood is not necessarily reflective of what childhood must always be. But children deserve safety, and they deserve love and dignity in every way. So how can we do that? How do we support that? And I will say, India has made huge strides. I look specifically at the legislation here on child marriage. This is fairly new in the sense, and I'm saying pre-COVID, but new. Far better than the United States is doing. And mind you, I come from the country that is the only one who has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We don't have a child's rights language even in the United States. And child marriage is only illegal in 6 states. 6 out of 50. Child marriage is completely legal at the age of 14, sometimes with parental consent and sometimes with judicial consent. But the reality is that children around the world are facing numerous challenges. And so we have to give children access and opportunity, and we have to look at the entire complex system. And COVID certainly added things. But I have to say that violence against children and poverty and access to education and healthcare, these things are not inevitable. Every child has a right to grow up free from violence, and every child has to grow up to meet their full potential. And we need to actually work together to realize that vision. They're relying on us. So what is it that we can do in our own communities? I said yesterday in the child dignity session that we need to figure out how to open our doors. There's never going to be enough money for education. It's just never going to happen. It's never going to become the priority. There's never going to be enough food given by governments to make sure that people have enough food on their table. There's never going to be enough food so everybody has a house that fits their whole family. Governments can't do that, but we can. If there's if after school you see their children in the street, open the doors to your house of worship. Open them wide, let the kids in, provide them with the oversight, the supervision, the help that they need. Make sure that you have children's programs, that you have somebody there to help with homework. Give children the opportunity. That's on us. This is where the public, private, public, faith, government, religious partnerships begin. And when we do that, we lead by our example, we actually change systems. And I think that's really what it comes down to. We have to fill in those gaps, and they are huge. But we have a moral obligation, and I hope that we have a will to do it.
Are there other questions? Okay, let's take that one.
Thank you so much. I'm Rachel with Bellwether International, and my question has to do with global coverage of what's unfolding in the world, particularly the G20. News coverage primarily comes out of the West. The West is informed by a secular mindset, which discredits and stigmatizes the role of faith leaders and leads to increasing religious illiteracy that's causing violence all over the world. But how do we balance that stigma, that secularization of thought at the G20 with the very pertinent reality that religious leaders also need to be held accountable, particularly along the fringes of religious extremism? And what implications are there of global news coverage coming out of the West for G20 conversations that concern faith communities?
Good. We're coming to the close of the session, so what I think we'll do is we'll take Maria Lucia's challenge as sort of the center piece of what do we do next and how do we move beyond the people who are here to the, quote, religious communities such as it is. Whether it exists is, of course, debatable. But let's start with Fletcher this time and come along with what are your basic, I think you've given us a pretty clear idea of your path forward, but do you have some specifics on what you'd like to see? And then we'll go along to each of you with that clarion challenge.
Sure. I mean, we're an activist organization, and to us, what we have seen consistently in the climate space, and I think it's true in most spaces, is that change happens when there's adequate mass social pressure for it to happen. And so because of that, the methodologies that we use are movement building methodologies, popular education, training and campaigning. You know, we've all heard Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. King referenced many times here. I think it's very important to remember that that's the kind of work they did. They created enough popular following and enough public moral power, and were able to exercise it to force governments, the most powerful governments in the world, to change. So I think from our perspective in this day and age, what's needed is a strong balance within the religious sector between the kind of insider expertise that's able to talk on the inside of different intergovernmental and national forums, with a very strong commitment to public movement building and an understanding that, frankly, the movement building is the wind in the sails that makes other things possible. I think, you know, as in terms of other closing pieces, we see courageous grassroots religious and spiritual people all over the world doing this work more and more. And we need to be clear that they do so at risk to themselves. There is an increase in state surveillance of activism of all kinds. For example, in France, our staff there routinely turns off their cell phones and leaves them outside of meeting rooms because they know that the French government uses the Pegasus software to surveil on activist meetings. That's in France. In different places across East Africa, where our team is organizing support against the East Africa crude oil pipeline. The religious communities that we work with routinely, they get all of the proper permits for a peaceful protest, and agents of the state and of the corporations, Total Energy in particular in that region, which is the sponsor of the big pipeline project, threaten them with physical violence and threaten their lives. This is and you know, imprison them for days at a time with no good reason. So this is, you know, part of the landscape. I think that one needs religious and spiritual strength to do that kind of work, and one needs a reckoning about what faith is about. In New York, we see courageous faith-based activists going inside the headquarters of BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, one of the world's largest investors in new fossil fuel projects, and holding prayer vigils and refusing to leave until the police come and remove them. That's not the only way that change is created, but without that kind of passionate leading edge, change will not happen. So I think that religious communities need to commit to supporting that type of activity alongside the other kinds of very important sort of insider type activity, because together that's how we get the world that we want and that we need and that all of our religions call for.
The insider-outsider. Suffolk.
Thank you, Catherine. And by the way, Reverend, you have just depicted what I was trying to say it in so many words in Amina's Somali woman's story. That puts it all in a nutshell, and thank you for sharing that as well. So I think 1C may be missing in response to that ethical leadership. Is that what about corruption? That is a driver for everything that is amongst that 4C's. corruption that drives corruption of our, values, corruption of the system, and corruption that drives actually as a main factor the conflicts as well as the climate impact efforts that you put it also in so many examples. So how to fight corruption? Is it only by legislation, or there is a cultural transformation needed? And who would have the most powerful voice in it? As Rabbi Diana was saying, 85% of the world is believers, are believers. So of faith, different faith traditions, Abrahamic religions, spiritual movements. So that is an immense power that is at the disposal of religious leadership, religious institutions, faith-based communities, and their respected members. And I suggest that without looking at that corruption and how to transform that in our respective societies, communities, the leaderships, the leaders of G20 group cannot do anything. No legislation will resolve it if society do not actually internalize it. That goes for discrimination. That goes for a lot of triggers that are the root causes for what we are discussing in this four-word topic headline. So I would suggest that they can, I think it would be wonderful if they can actually commit, if it is climate education, more climate-aware generations to come. If it is development funding and how to use that in an equitable, responsibly sharing method amongst least developed countries and the highly developed countries. So with all that, maybe they can commit not only to come up with the technical pledges, technical commitments, technical agreements, but to commit to do culturally transformative campaigns hand in hand with the religious leadership across the board, across the world. That is the only way that anything can bear fruit. With the dedication of a decade, it can be possible. And that can also help towards peace-building culture to actually start with, planting its seeds at the very least. So I will stop there, but okay. Maybe that could be some kind of commitment that I would like to see happening, for instance.
A lot of challenges there. I think the corruption issue is one that's really been on our agenda for a long time, but coming out of this meeting, I think there's the need to restore some kind of faith in governments, which is not easy. Diana, quick last word, and then Sadvi, because we're over time.
Sure thing. I'm just thinking that restoring faith in government. And that's a really hard one, I think, for any of us to swallow in the sense of and internalize. Because I don't think we always have a lot of faith in our elected officials or non-elected officials, but our leadership. As much as what we think is perhaps even elected is really the people who are in government long term and don't necessarily make changes. I know this afternoon there's going to be a conversation about network of networks, and I think that's where a large part of Maria Lucia's question will be answered. There are incredible networks out there, Religions for Peace, GNRC, we're all part of so many of them. That's why coming together is like coming together with old friends. But there is a lot to be said for this inside-outside perspective. Thank you, Fletcher, for bringing that up, because I think that's a really important point. I'm somebody who's actually worked a little bit in government. I worked for a congressman in the United States for a couple of years. I worked on the social issues of the day in the United States, really protecting vulnerable populations. And as a result, I understand how my government functions. So when people ask me, like, oh, let's get involved and let's have a protest and this, that, and I'm like, that's great, but what are you actually doing to lobby? To lobby? How are you getting inside the room? And we think about that if we go back in time at the United Nations in New York City, there was always the times where the religious community was outside and we were protesting something that was going on at UNGA, something that was going on at the Security Council, and we had no space at the table. I now have a badge. I can get on campus. I can get a meeting with the SG. There is importance in having an entree to the room. We have to be in the room where decisions are happening. Our advocates, our voices need to be in the room. And then they have to feel the pressure from outside because there is a chorus of people saying, this is what we need. We need a moral, ethical governance. We need to live in a world that is healthy, not just for us as human beings, but for the planet itself, because we don't have another home. And this is our home. So I think that's where the movement comes. And it happens on a very grassroots level. I don't care if you're going and you're protesting your local town council, your local mayor, village leader, et cetera, or you're going to the president or prime minister of your country. We have to find a balance. And it can't just be, oh, we did this yesterday and we're done. Like, I'm done. When I saw in the United States, when there was huge protests going on at the end of in 2020 because of police brutality, I was awed by the organizing, awed. And if you were invited to an Instagram page, you knew where every protest in town was happening. I knew where every protest in New York City was happening, and Chicago, and in Dubuque, Iowa. The fact is that people can organize, and it doesn't take a lot of resources. It doesn't take a lot of money to get out there and protest, to get out there and have a prayer vigil, to get out there and be with like-minded people, raise awareness and raise the issues. Rabbi Hillel said 2,000 years ago, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? If not now, when? When? Today, yesterday, and tomorrow.
So, a few very quick points in response to that really important and powerful question of what we as the leadership can and should be doing. I think number one, we need to change our definition of what in Hindi we call pap and punya, means sin and merit. We brought that up a lot when we were doing the work around ending open defecation, for example, helping people understand this is no longer simply a personal choice. It's no longer about where you would like to poop. Your open defecation now counts as what we would call pop, sin, because due to that, people are getting sick and dying. So while we all know that canon is eternal, nobody's talking about rewriting scripture, there is absolutely a lot of space, and I think that space needs to be utilized and expanded for cultural, societal, time-bound aspects of sin and merit, pap and punya, how we interpret things as they relate to today. Number two, I think we need a different definition of success, all the way from the top down. The definition of success that currently exists that has to do with essentially how much I can make and then spend needs to change. This idea of more is somehow better, And of course, I need to have that more and more and more, cheaper, 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 because I also want more and more and more money still sitting in my pockets, means inevitably that that which I'm purchasing is being produced by women and children in sweatshops. It means that the factories that are producing it are cutting corners, engaging in corruption, not treating their waste, and it is spewing into the land, into the water, into the air. So we need to have entirely new definitions of what does success mean from a position of faith, from a position of religious leadership. We need to be prepared to act on what we call the grand level and the ground level. So the ground level is all of the grassroots work that we're all doing, whether it's building school centers for women, whether we're working with water, whether we're feeding, healthcare, whatever we're doing on the ground. We also need to be working on what we call the grand level, which means to the extent possible with governments. I know we work really closely with all levels of government, our most local government, our state government, federal governments, really getting that into the room, but into the room not just on a badge situation, but on a close relationship situation, so that we can then be the ones going in and saying, hey, you know, there's this new technology and it cleans rivers. Hey, there's this new technology that actually can be used to take all of this farming waste that is burned by the farmers every October and November, that leads to the pollution that kills God knows how many people in Delhi, Haryana, Chandigarh, that whole area. That actually can be used to build cheap houses. You say government doesn't have money for it. They don't, but there's technologies that make that so cheap. So once you've made that connection, and it's not us versus you, you actually have the ability to affect greater and greater change. And lastly, I think we need to have the courage, I keep coming back to courage, to use our pulpits to talk about where we are today in the world. There is a courage that is needed on behalf of the religious leaders to really own up to the fact that regardless of whether you get paid for your job or not, you are a leader of faith. You are here not just as someone punching a time clock, doing a job that someone else is telling you to do, but there is a responsibility to step up to that which is needed. Yes, we talk about worship of the Creator and the divine Creator, but we now need to talk about protection of the creation, protecting, serving that creation, and use those pulpits to be talking about water usage, to be talking about, last example, every evening on the banks of Ganga when we gather for our evening prayer ceremony, every evening there's a minimum of hundreds up to many thousands a night. And every night we're talking about something related to not polluting your water, not polluting your air, carrying your own bags when you go grocery shopping, not using single-use plastic, not discriminating against women, menstrual hygiene, whatever it may be. But using those pulpits to speak not just about, as I was saying yesterday, that heaven or moksha after we die, but how to actually create that here where we're living.
Thank you. As you can see, this is a panel with lots of energy and lots of ideas. I won't try to summarize. I do just want to say that we left one hanging question, which is dealing with the media and the ways in which is a huge topic in itself, of how one has the integrity and honesty to look at the complexity of these religious worlds, but also to balance some of the positive and the negative in ways that actually take us forward as opposed to take us in circles. So I'm sure we will be coming back on that. So thank you very much. And to all of you, and more power to you as we move forward.
Thank you so much. And I know that many of these points that we talked about right now will be continuing as we go to the breakout sessions.